Welcome to Family Features, a podcast for anyone who wants to experience healthy relationships within their family. This is Dr. Corey Gilbert, and I'm honored to come alongside you to encourage, educate, and equip you as we focus on the different relationships that make us family. Let's get started and focus on today's feature. Welcome to the Family Features podcast. My name is Dr. Corey Gilbert, and today I have a great honor of having a conversation with Dr. Kelli Palfy, psychologist and author of Men Too: Unspoken Truths About Male Sexual Abuse. So this is going to be a tough topic, but it is so important. So Kelli, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, looking forward to this conversation. This is not one that we hear about almost anywhere. So I'm so excited that you've not only written your book, but the research you've done and the time you spent in this. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your story, and how this book came about.
Sure. Okay. So prior to becoming a psychologist, I was a Royal Canadian Mounted Police officer. So that's the kind of like Canadian equivalent to your FBI. And
whoa, so that's like pause right there. You were what? You were basically a Canadian FBI agent?
Royal Canadian Mounted Police, yes. And in the
what
course
a career
of my,
change.
Yes.
What a career change.
Yes and no, honestly. I actually work a lot with first responders now and with the population that I used to investigate or assist in investigations. So yeah.
That's so neat.
Yeah. So to be brutally honest, I was part of the inception of the Integrated Child Sexual Exploitation Unit, the first one that we actually had in the RCMP, which is, I believe it was the first one, which is in British Columbia. Yeah, Manitoba had one already, and then we developed the first one within the RCMP. And the crazy part was that, you know, we were supposed to be the experts, right? And so I won't do the whole backstory because that would take 20 minutes, but basically I witnessed that men and boys were victims too.
Yes. Because
of the evidence that we had seized and were being forced to review. But what we weren't seeing was men reporting these crimes. So at a training seminar, a professional hockey player that had been abused by his coach came and spoke to us about why he didn't report his abuse. And it just shocked me, floored me, like just made me so sad, because it was like, I would say God opened my eyes at that point. Prior to being a police lady, I'd been a corrections officer, and I had remembered questioning, like, why are there so many men in jail? And when he talked about how he turned to substance abuse and stuff like that, it was like the lights went on. Mm-hmm. And I knew that like his reasons would not be the same reasons as every other man out there. I mean, obviously not every victim turns to substance abuse and whatnot and winds up in jail. So when I pursued my doctoral research, I decided to study why boys and men were not coming forward. And my book was an offshoot of that. So that's the very, very short version about how I got involved in this type of work.
Yeah, so you definitely have an intimate kind of insight into that because of all your years of work and the positions you've had, and then the access to research. So men and boys don't report. We definitely know that there's not a lot of reporting, but yet it's happening. So what have you learned from that?
Well, research shows that approximately 1 out of every 6 males is sexually assaulted to some extent prior to the age of 16. The problem that happens is that a lot of boys and men, whether it's due to, you know, Western cultural biases or just their own ideas about masculinity, they don't recognize themselves as victims often case.
Correct.
So this can have a profound effect on a man as he chooses to enter into an intimate relationship, as he chooses to enter the workforce. And yeah, it could just, you know, sort of depending on whether or not he recognizes himself as a victim. Like I say, I would say a majority of men struggle. If the abuse was not violent in nature, they would struggle to recognize or accept the fact that they might have been abused.
And that's absolutely what I've seen in my 22 years of counseling.
Right.
That. So, and again, it's only a small number because even it's hard to have those conversations, because if you don't want to see it as trauma or as abuse or even affect to them, so they actually have other ways it's playing out. So how is it playing out?
Absolutely. You're bang on there, and there will come into therapy for other reasons, like anger issues or intimacy issues, or yeah, one partner's not happy, they'll come into therapy for those reasons. And, to be fair, the husband may not even recognize that this is what's the problem.
Exactly.
So, yeah, so things that we see would be things like, perhaps the husband would be avoiding intimacy. Now, people who have a secret that they want to carry will stay a long ways away from any sort of deep, intimate conversation, lest he accidentally disclose or she figure it out or something like that. So that's one thing that can happen. Anger issues, right? He could be angry at himself for not having stopped the abuse if he is aware that he's a victim, angry at himself for having responded physiologically if his body did. He may judge himself as if he knew then what he knows now. And that anger, if he cannot project that anger appropriately in the right direction, he's going to turn that anger inward towards himself, and that can lead to depression. He could wind up picking fights with his intimate partner because he feels not understood, or like she would break up with him or end it, or be disgusted with him if he were to tell his truth. It's too
risky. It's too risky.
Yes, exactly. And part of why they feel like they survived all this time is because they have maintained their silence. And it can manifest as things like a husband not wanting to assist with childcare, right? So there was a misconception that still exists today that if I was abused, I'm going to be an abuser, and that's absolutely not. There's no. The research shows that less than 10% of victims turn into abusers themselves. So, but because most offenders will say they were abused, whether or not that's true, there's this fear that if I was abused, there's a risk that I'll turn into an offender. So a lot of fathers will, for example, stay a long ways away from bathing their children or changing diapers, that kind of thing. Conversely, if they are taking part in those activities, they could be very triggered. They could be very upset with themselves for, having to see their child's genitals or something like that. Like, be filled with a shame response, be, needing to turn or wanting to turn to substances, that kind of thing.
Yeah. You've discovered so much here that, we need to probably spend hours unpacking. Like, it's so important. And I love even the way that you put the title of your book, the Me Too, adding the N, is men. This happens to men too. The sad thing is our culture does not allow for a space for it to be admitted if you do recognize it, but how often we don't recognize it. So there's two really big problems.
Yeah, right. Yeah, both extremes. And I mean, it's changing. Our society is changing, but not fast enough to support the men that are in that situation now. I mean, Hollywood has romanticized male sexual abuse for years. It's a coming of age experience. Yeah, it's terrible. I always say if you switch the genders around, that would never be an acceptable movie for people to watch.
Well, and what we've seen in court cases over the last number of years where women have actually perpetrated on teenage boys, and then we don't know what to do with that. If it was a man doing this to a girl, we know how to persecute that or prosecute that. We know how to go after him.
Sure.
But we end up, maybe it's different when no, it's not.
In a lot of ways, I see it as worse because, there's so many supports for women. It's completely socially acceptable for a woman to need those supports.
Right.
Whereas a man might believe himself to be weak, or even, be given mixed messages by his friends. If he does disclose, his friends might be saying, "Oh man, you were lucky, she was hot," kind of thing, score, right? That this myth that a man should never want to turn down sex, that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's worse for men in a lot of ways. And I mean, it's so confusing for men. They just choose to stay silent because the fear of rejection, the shame, the confusion. Most men try to push it aside and just forget about it and try to tell themselves that it never affected them, but it does.
It does. And then it plays out in their relationships or the lack of relationships.
Absolutely.
In their own personal fantasy life, their own identity. Then that plays out in their work, plays out in, they don't see how much it hits everything. So what about when marriages then? So when you think of this man who's had this past, who no one knows about, and then he meets someone and he gets married to his bride.
Mhm.
Where does it go wrong? What have you seen as to kind of where this kind of starts coming out?
Well, again, I mean, it could be this avoidance of intimacy,
Right. Mm-hmm.
because he might be afraid he might accidentally disclose. He could be struggling with, if, for example, his body responded, or he's confused, just about the fact that he was, had an erection or whatever during the abuse, or was brought to that point. He might be trying to prove to himself his own masculinity. So that could be promiscuity, pornography. It could be like, it could be just engaging in other acts of hypermasculinity that he might not normally have engaged in, right? So whether that's extreme sports or, avoidance in the sense of becoming an absolute workaholic, right? He might, it's an easy way to avoid intimacy if I'm never home, if I'm at the office, or I need to have some sort of a sense of achievement. So I will become a workaholic, right? And I will succeed in my career at the cost of my personal relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've seen with couples the impact of where their so as a couple, where your husband's at matters when it comes to his theology or belief system of just sexuality, masculinity, gender, marriage. And the truth is most have never even thought through it.
Absolutely.
So they need to.
And unfortunately, a lot of boys are abused by someone who is associated to a Christian organization. So a lot of these victims are walking away from their faith, right? It's a pretty common known fact that pedophiles love to insert themselves into Christian organizations because they have, they believe that Christians are easy targets, unfortunately. They think, Christians are supposed to believe the good in all people. So therefore, they're naive and trusting. And they have access, absolutely.
That's where, like Boy Scouts years ago, I've heard so many stories of Boy Scout leaders and boys who've been harmed because it was, hey, let's go out into the woods. There weren't these safeguards. Absolutely. Where now I'm in Boy Scouts with my kids. It is one of the safest places because of the rules that are in place, or can be one of the safest places. I would even dare say safer than most churches because of the lack of boundaries and rules. My wife and I were in a church in Georgia that was really neat because of the pastor's wife's, her own story and her own boundaries. She had some rules set in place at the church that I couldn't be alone. No one could be alone in a room with kids.
Awesome.
But a husband and wife couldn't work together in the room either.
Yeah. Okay.
So that if like I were to do something, she would cover for me. That kind of weirdness. And so she had all these rules that was like,
absolutely.
I love this. Protect me from even the perception of evil, if you will.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Right.
Yeah, because people that are wanting to work in the nursery at churches, even most churches do a background check. They're not going to hand you that piece of paper if they know they have a background to check. So that's not how we catch this. Yeah. So then they're not going to come, and the way that there's access is really scary. What are some other things you found in some of your research and about men and kind of where they get stuck? Whether in marriage or just kind of wherever you.
Yeah, I think, like this, just the concept that they don't want to get the help that they may benefit from because there's this fear that I'm the only one this ever happened to. There must be something wrong with me. If I tell them, they're not going to understand. They're going to throw me out, right? They're going to treat me differently, right? So I think that's a big hang up for a lot of boys and men, right? Yes. Aside from the recognizing that they were in fact victimized, that's the first hang up right there, right?
Yes, right there.
I was 13, I was 13, she was my babysitter, she was 16, she was hot, all those things they tell themselves, whereas if it was a 16-year-old male babysitter with a 13-year-old girl, there would be no question, right?
Right. Absolutely true.
Yeah, so that's one of the first big hangups, is even recognizing that they were victims. And then second, taking a look at all the ways that they may have impacted their career choices, their relationship choices, how they parent, what they allow their children to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely every area of life is impacted by abuse.
Right.
Their ability to trust, huge.
And if it was a male that did this, like you mentioned a couple of times, their body kind of betrayed them. Yeah, oftentimes, where I had a physical response, an erection, and I didn't want to. So there's this disconnect, and then there's this anger that's turned towards myself, not towards the abuser, because, well, I'm supposed to be a sexual person, so therefore this should be okay, or this should be wanted. There's so many levels and layers of the way that we justify it, basically.
Absolutely. And it's even harder for them if, for example, they grew up in an environment where they were lacking affection and their offender was one of their only sources of affection. So naturally, they need that affection. They go back for more, right? What child does not want attention? So the profound sense of shame, if that's where they've gone to get their attention, to get their affection.
Big one too. Yeah, well, it didn't just happen once or twice. Then they sought it out.
Yeah.
And then the shame from that just heaps on. And then you fast forward to you're married now. And this is where a lot of those listening, your husband may be one of these that actually is a victim of sexual abuse and has no clue, or very much has a clue, but has done everything in his power to run from it, to hide it, to fight it, to stuff it.
And it's very often the case that they will not disclose until after their marriages implode, right? Because they will try everything to keep this secret. Yeah. Then after the marriage finally implodes, they'll say, you know, maybe I need to deal with this. Yeah. That's usually when I see them.
Right. And
after that. Yeah.
I saw this one couple, like, we're dealing with her sexual abuse, but luckily we were working as a couple. It was incredible. And about halfway through this about 6-month period, all of a sudden it was like, well, he does too. And wow, did things even turn more and just beautiful too.
Absolutely. The intimacy that can be created when they trust each other enough to, you know, to be that person, to be that support, to, you know, continue to be the intimate partner they married.
Yes. And that's the commitment that we need to make. Is really whatever you disclose, I need to stay in. I need to be all in. But this is going to be hard. That's a hard commitment for anyone to make.
Well, and you know, I'm just working on a workbook right now that's going to help male survivors bring up those conversations, right? So I recognize, because it's not easy, right? So for example, I would suggest, you know, starting off with a disclosure like, hey, you know, there are some reasons that I maybe haven't spoken to you about before. You know, I am a bit confused about how much they impact me, but it could be relevant, and I need you to do X, Y, and Z. And, you know, or maybe, you know, I'm going to talk to someone else first about how to talk to you about this, but, you know, and I need your patience. And, you know, for example, I don't want you to pity me. I don't want you to look at me as less of a man. I don't want you to change how you treat me. Those kinds of things, like for them to sort of look at their own needs and say, okay, if I'm going to be honest with this, what do I need?
And it's getting instruction, which is actually, we act like we're supposed to know it all as a husband or wife. No, I learned how to love my wife by her teaching me. She learns to love me by me teaching her. We don't see that as a part of marriage, but it's actually a critical part of every relationship.
Absolutely.
Teaching boundaries, teaching what I can and can't handle, or please don't talk about money at midnight, that kind of thing.
Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, I would even take it one step farther and suggest, you know, disclose in bite-sized pieces, right? Like what you're comfortable disclosing, try it on. Like, you know, I was or actually abused, right? I'm not comfortable talking about it quite yet, but just wanted you to know that this is what I'm struggling with. This is what I'm not comfortable talking about. Or, you know, I would just caution them from minimizing their own abuse, right? Because that's typically what men do. They will minimize their own abuse. They will try to rewrite their own memories and tell themselves that they actually enjoyed it. And then if their perpetrator was male, shaming, right? Like, you know, there's a lot of confusion for a male who's aroused for the first time by someone who's, for example, offered to teach him how to masturbate, right? Like, they're confused about whether or not they're actually attracted to men or women. And it's, that's why we have laws in place.
Yeah. And we need to protect those laws. And I think we're not doing a good job of that. I think we're moving into a kind of everything goes, there are no boundaries, but then shame on you, shame on you, shame on you. It's like, wait a minute, you can't have both. There needs to be boundaries, and we need to stop. We need to shame the right people in a sense, as in shame a perpetrator, not the victim.
Absolutely.
Where I wouldn't ask any of my students or clients or anyone to have to face the court system. Like the court system is they're doing better of being more trauma informed and being more kind of the whole CASA, the almost advocate, but it's still to parade your story up in front of a jury, and I wouldn't wish that. I wouldn't wish
secondary
trauma.
Secondary trauma. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So I guess my take home for your listeners would be like, if you're struggling with these, anger issues or intimacy issues, or your husband is like engaging in acts of hypermasculinity, always trying to prove his masculinity, always pushing you away, always picking fights, always, right? Just, it's a distance creator if I can pick a fight, or, always away, not engaged with the kids, those kind of things. It might be something worth looking at, and that is what I wrote my book about, which was, why are boys and men not disclosing? One of the reasons is because they often feel like what they would have to disclose will be too much for their partner to handle.
Right.
You couldn't handle the truth, right?
Yeah.
So, and if for the wives listening, I think their role would be to create that safe space and say, hey, if this is an issue, we can handle it together, and it's not your fault. It wasn't your fault. It wasn't up to you. Those kinds of things, right?
Yeah. Well, like through your book, I bet you more women will be buying that book than men.
I often get the women reading it first, right? Because they want to be able to support their partner. They want to be able to understand, which, in my book, that was one of the two purposes to writing my book were to support male survivors and to create education pieces for, women and partners, and helping professionals, pastors, to be able to understand the struggles that boys and men go through. It's a lifelong struggle. It's not just one and done. It's a lifelong struggle of, avoidance, blocking, hiding, rewriting. Right.
Which I'll mention, your website is kellipalfy.com.
Yeah.
.com, yes. And we'll have that in show notes in terms of spelling and all that, kellipalfy.com. And you can access videos and other content, and then obviously purchase the book there too. You offer services, but in your area, there in Canada. So this is so important for us to talk about, because I can think of so many wives who they know something's wrong, but they can't put their finger on it. And so to be able to maybe read this and I hope it's wrong. I hope you're wrong. I hope you read this and find out there's something else and it's not this, but what if it was? Let's eliminate this one.
And the other thing, like I've had men that I've counseled want to be able to tell their wives, and they struggle to do this. What a couple of my clients have just simply left my book around, because for them it's an easy, this is my psychologist, this is what she wrote. And then they leave the book laying on the counter and the conversation comes up, right?
That's great.
Alternatively, parents, read my book so that you can, be aware of what could be going on with your boys, your sons, right?
So true.
Yeah, a majority of
that. That's so important.
Yeah, absolutely.
For you to read that as a parent, to inform and protect your sons from themselves of being sons or daughters being a perpetrator, if you will, but also so they can actually have an understanding of boundaries. And
I would say more so, not necessarily to keep their sons or daughters from being perpetrators, but to prevent them from being groomed by an offender. Because I go through the grooming techniques. I go through the 3 stages of grooming, which is the groomer grooms himself, then he grooms the victim's family, and then he grooms the child before he acts as the child. And then I go through all the ways that trauma can manifest itself in a male victim's life. Like, for example, they might be misdiagnosed as being OCD or ADHD or just any of those things, when really it's a manifestation of their trauma. And the reasons why they will, even despite all the trouble they're getting into, all the misdiagnosis, they will remain silent, whether that's fear or, fear of being labeled a victim, fear of being labeled homosexual, fear that, actually I was quite shocked in my research. A lot of the boys that men that I interviewed who were victimized as boys said they did not disclose to their parents because their parents already had too much on their plate. So they're already doing what culture teaches them to do, which is be men, right? Protect, provide. So even as little boys, they're protecting their parents from information they think would be too hard to handle, especially if the parent has another child with high needs.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's so amazing.
Yeah. Pedophiles are experts at targeting vulnerable children, whether that's the kid that's already got a history of lying, the kid whose sister needs more attention than their parents have to give to, two-parent working families, which most people are. And, little Johnny can't go to baseball unless I drive. And the offenders will find a way to fill a need, befriend the parents. What people need to know, and I'm sure most people know this now, is that 95% of child sexual abuse is perpetrated by someone the family knows and loves. Yes. And that is not easy to stomach, but it is true.
That's part of what I teach in my trauma class is it's 91% is what I show them, that 9% is stranger danger. And that's what we actually spend more time on.
Right.
And that 91% is someone that was invited in the home, that was a part of the family or a family member. Or, someone that would actually had been vetted, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely.
They made their way in. So this is really good. The grooming process is so critical to know.
Yes, I cannot emphasize enough that people have to become familiar with that process, because then you can spot it, right?
Yes. And the problem is you can spot it, but you can't spot it until it's almost too late. Yeah. So being able to know the process allows you way more insight. And a lot of it isn't necessarily, you don't want to, yes, you want to spot it afterwards so you can help the victim. Goodness, yes. But the prevention is some of the just safeguards you set up as a family.
Yeah,
you don't allow certain times alone with someone that's not mom or dad, but even how many stepdads especially have actually perpetrated.
Absolutely. So, an offender will marry someone who has children just below his age and gender of preference, or age of preference, right? I know it makes your skin curl, but they are professionals. It is their career aspirations. That is their only goal in life. If you and I are happy to be helpers, they're happy to be pedophiles.
Yeah.
Terrible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Scary.
This is so important.
I know. And, 90% of abuse being perpetrated by someone that we know and love is not something we want to accept. And that is why it keeps being perpetrated, because offenders count on their reputations that they build. That's the grooming themselves process. They set themselves up in a community to be perceived as the least likely person you'd ever suspect would do that. So when little Johnny, who's already been in trouble for stealing cookies out of the cookie jar, hitting his sister or whatever, breaking a window, says, "Hey mom, this happened." Oh, guess what? He's lying again, right? It's horrendous. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah. So.
And then you get the adult, which is what we kind of even just started on, that it plays out in their life, but they don't even see it or they're hiding it. So the support that you provide, other counselors, the truth is, I would say most counselors are not prepared to deal with this issue. Yeah. And so find a counselor, find a group that will actually go there. How many counselors I've talked to who are clients who've gone to counselors who, as soon as you bring up this topic, the counselor changes the subject.
And you know what I would say? Yeah, I would say to that, buy my book and get your counselor to read it too.
Yes, it's a great idea. Great idea. Yes.
Another thing that I think I would just mention in regards to how male sexual abuse can affect a couple is, if anyone has to be forced to push down those bad emotions, just the suppressing of the bad emotions also causes us to suppress the good emotions. So, somebody might be saying, I'm not in love anymore. I'm not happy in my marriage. when really the case is that they've had to suppress their emotion to the extent they are no longer feeling those good ones.
Right. That's a great point. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah. You're basically suppressing them all. You're cutting yourself off from being human. Yeah. In order to survive. Yeah. And I would even dare say 100% of us have our issues.
Oh, yeah.
The mental health, like, oh, you have a mental health issue. No, we all have mental health issues. What's yours?
Yeah.
And so it's like, when we start normalizing this, it's like, not all of us are ADD, but ADD is more, because of the way we define it, it's more typical than we realize. So let's not label it as that and go, oh, it stinks that you have ADD. Let's actually go, how are we going to help support you in the fact that you have a propensity to have these struggles? Oh, you're bipolar. Oh, you're depression or anxiety. It's like, when we understand what we're dealing with, that's the first step. It's half the battle is defining it. Then it's not an excuse. We don't tattoo it on our forehead. It becomes, okay, how steep is my hill in terms of what I need to do to overcome some of the liabilities I have against myself. And then life's very different. Yeah.
I'm not sure if you've had a chance to read Dr. Bruce Perry and Oprah wrote a book together called What Happened to You? And I love that book. It's not a Christian-based book. It's certainly not against Christianity. But it's called What Happened to You? And he's basically trying to, change the question from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, right? So I love that reframe. I think it's so relevant. Yes. And I think it's the approach we need to take.
And I would say 100% of us. We think of it that way. Yeah. We don't go, oh, they have mental health issues, implying that I don't. Yeah. It's like, what happened to you? Exactly. And same for then you're able to be in the same community with that person going, because things happen to me too. Yeah. We have issues in our family growing up. We had hard moments, whether it was moving from house to house or school to school or serious trauma and loss. And so, we're all broken and we need a savior.
Yeah. Thank God we have one.
I know. So that's where in the end, some of this journey is pointing the people to the cross. But as you mentioned earlier, it's hard to do that when the harm happened in the church.
Yeah. So I really want to make the church the place that men go for healing, not to be, I have worked with several men who have walked away from their faith because the church chose to support the pedophile instead of them. The church chose to believe the offender. And it's devastating on so many levels. Because the perpetrator still gets to be in that community and continue to offend against other children or what have you. And the victim is left, feeling like, why did God let this happen? Because, they don't understand that this is human failure, not God failure, right? So.
And it's funny, you work mostly with men there. I've worked mostly with women. Same story, though. How many have been so harmed by leadership in the church, they just didn't get it, didn't see, thought they were doing the right thing, but were missing the heart of this little girl or this little boy or young man or young woman. We need to create a place of healing.
Well, again, back to that idea, it's unfathomable. I mean, research shows that we all think we think the same, right? So you and I would never do these things. 90% of the population, more than 90, like 95, 97% of the population would never want to harm a child. 3% of the population, and I'm just throwing numbers out there, I don't know if these are real, make it their career, right? Yeah. So that's the point though, like offenders, especially those who offend against boys, have large populations of victims. Like the research shows that one offender will have approximately 150 victims each across a lifetime. So they're offending against the boys of their age of preference while they're their age of preference. Then they age out and they stay silent. And then they find another victim. They age out, they stay silent. They find another victim. It's brutal. Yeah. And some of these people,
go ahead.
I was just going to say some boys recognize this and will choose to take the abuse so that the other person doesn't have to. It's brutal.
I've seen that with girls as well, protecting their sisters.
Yes, I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah.
We need to be a voice for the for those victims and speak out against this, which is again what your book is attempting to do. And you also, just for those listening, if you want to book Dr. Kelli here, Dr. Kelli Palfy, to come speak, she does that as well. But again, this is a book that should be on our shelves in our church libraries, in our community, because this needs to be talked about. This is the kind of stuff I spend my time reading all the time. And I know many of you listening, you don't want to read at all. And I understand that. But the importance is so critical that we be a voice for those that, and literally these men don't have a voice because of the cultural silences them. So.
And I do recognize that a lot of people don't feel they have time to read a book. So I actually audio recorded the book as well. Nice. And you could listen to it on your commute.
That is perfect. That's like awesome. That's good. Yes. So helpful. Yep. So I guess the next question I even have is, so now what? Like, you've done this. Oh my gosh. The workbook. I love the idea of the workbook.
Well, I've got, myself and a colleague have just complete children's series, which is so parents can have those very uncomfortable conversations with the children, because people often wonder, like, how do you talk about this stuff? What do we, right? So we're still fighting with our illustrator trying to get it uploaded, but we have complete these 3 books. One I uploaded yesterday, and the other 2, I mean, they'll all be uploaded before Christmas, even if we have to redo the whole darn things. But yeah, so we have, myself and a colleague have created a children's book series called Creating Safer Spaces. Creating Personal Safety series, sorry. Creating Personal Safety series. Nice. And the first book is about a little boy being groomed by a friend of his father's, a coworker of his father's, being groomed through the use of his little part-time job helping out with puppies. And it's not super graphic or anything. It gets the point across without traumatizing anybody, hopefully. Good. The second book is about a little girl who goes to therapy and works with a therapy dog, and just talks about how much she's learned from being in therapy. And then the third one is about a teenage girl who gets involved with a party and picture taking, and it ends up in a human trafficking situation. And they all end well. They all have happy endings and big lessons and psychoeducational points that parents can bring up with kids. Yeah, it says now talk about this with your child, right? So nice. Yeah.
Oh, good. I look forward to those. That's really good. That's
all right.
Neat. Yeah, this is again one of those topics that we just don't want to talk about, but it's so important. And I hope those listening really do. It's not meant to alarm, but it's meant, if you're struggling in your marriage, we need to talk about. So we might need to have a business meeting as a couple and kind of go, what's going on? Give some space where that could be brought up if they were waiting to. Yes. Or again, this book could be a great Dr. Palfy's book.
And simply understanding that the reason boys and men don't recognize it and the reasons boys and men don't disclose can help.
Yes. Yeah, just understanding that psychoeducational word. Just learning can really change the way our compassion too, but also the tools we might need to enter into hard conversations. Because the goal is heal. The goal is growth. The goal is to strengthen them.
And also so that we don't accidentally put out judgment, right?
Nice. I love that.
I know people would say, well, I would never judge if I learned that. But, a lot of times it's done, I want to say accidentally. I like to give the example. I had a client who had been abused as a boy, and as a result of that abuse, he developed an aversion to putting a toothbrush in his mouth, which is understandable given his abuse.
Yes.
So he was past the stage where his parents checked on him anymore as far as his toothbrushing. So it went unnoticed for 7 years, which I think is a bit excessive. I mean, did you buy him a new toothbrush during that time? But anyway, and these were his adult teeth at this point. So he ended up with very significant damage to his teeth. As an adult, he'd saved $50,000 and tried to go get his teeth fixed. Well, the dental hygienist shamed him so bad, he got up and laughed. So just an example of how someone who was a male survivor could accidentally be judged without even kind of knowing that we're doing it, right?
Great example. Yeah. And there's so many areas like that we misinterpret what they're doing or the signals.
Why does your husband refuse to go to a chiropractor? maybe because he was abused by a man and he's afraid to be touched by a man. He doesn't trust men, right?
Yeah.
Why does your husband refuse to go to the dentist? Because he's traumatized while he's completely in the black zone while he's in the dentist chair, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it can manifest itself in so many ways. But honestly, I think, anytime you're struggling with these hard no's or hard, just excessive boundaries that don't make sense, consider abuse. Consider if there could have been abuse. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm to the point where when I see almost any diagnosis in the women that I work with, I'm looking behind it going, was there sexual abuse or trauma?
Absolutely.
And
same for men.
It almost always is. And the numbers are showing that it's almost the same for men. And that's scary.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the scariest part is the repression of it, right? Like I say, I literally think God opened my eyes to see this. If you call me a seer in that way or whatever, I don't know, but it was like, you know what? I worked in corrections and I remember being so confused. Why are there so many men in prison compared to women? Because I grew up seeing the not so good side of women too. And I was like, well, they're just as bad. Why are there more men in prison than women? And then, again, not to say if you're a victim, you wind up in jail. That's not the case. It's just,
look at those numbers.
Yeah, you get a male child or female that was sexually abused and is completely distracted, dysregulated, whatever, unable to sleep because of their abuse. What chance do they have of succeeding in grade 3 math, right?
Right. Yeah. And your history, where God has taken you in your career, I think is just a perfect setup where you've seen things that most of us haven't seen.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Corrections, but then your other work and then the access to data that helped you see something that again others aren't seeing. That's led to now this book, and I look forward to the workbook as well, just to see how that can be used in our churches, small groups. That's not an easy thing. We don't want to sign up for that, but we need to talk about this and be places of healing.
Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, I have also completed an 8-part series for churches. I'm just waiting for a pastor friend to finish up his part.
Ooh, nice. Good. And that'll all be on your website, right? Access to it?
When it's ready, yeah.
Good.
In the US, there is a group called Echoes. Pastor Robert Marshall is just kind of getting going with his ministry, I would say, but he's in the US and they're doing US tours, having dinners for male survivors, just creating awareness, and they've got support groups popping up and they're doing good stuff down there. Good
to hear. We need more of those. So that's so important.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Way overdue. I just this whole idea of, that we can't ignore this anymore is what I'm trying to say. It's too prevalent. We don't have that luxury anymore. Right. It's too prevalent.
Right. Well, I'm excited. And your website is kellipalfy.com.
Yep.
You can purchase book, access more content, and then also see some of the other stuff we've talked about here that'll be coming. I'm definitely excited about those children's books as well. So that's wonderful. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Kelli Palfy, for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.
Pleasure. Honored to have you on the show, and look forward to seeing what you do and how you change the world and point people to Christ.
Yeah. He can heal. I always say I can help, he can heal.
Exactly. That's a great statement. Love that.
Yeah. Okay.
Right,
Thank you, Corey. You too. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to the Family Features Podcast. It has been an honor to serve. Find out more about Dr. Gilbert and his resources for you and your family's growth and success at healinglives.com. And if you think you could use some support along the way, be sure to book that call at bookdrg.com. And one more thing, if you found this helpful, please share this podcast with others so that we can change the world together.